Thank you, Pia, and thank you for the invitation and for pulling this group together on this topic. It's mission critical that we get this right. So our mandate here is really to talk about the intersection of biological and cultural evolution, and cultural evolution obviously subsumes technological evolution, and just what this is, how this is changing us, and how any rational concern about human flourishing can track with these changes. Because, I mean, I think it's the peculiar vanity of every generation to think that this time is different, that this is, that things are uniquely precarious, or that things are changing faster than they ever have. But I think it is actually true to say that the vanity of the current generation is well-founded. I mean, things are changing to a degree that is leaving the world unrecognizable from one generation to the next. And I mean, as you know, if you go back 75,000 years, you could go to 1,000 years on any side of that period and nothing is different. You would just be handed the same stone tools and told to avoid large predators, and there's literally generation after generation saw no progress at all, and no real material change. So yeah, with that as a kind of launching point, I mean, your background in medicine and network theory and all of the points of contact with social science, sociology, and evolutionary biology, which your most recent book goes into a lot. How do you view what technology and recent changes in culture are doing to us?
So I knew this topic would come up, and I was trying to think of a terse way to answer it, and I don't have a terse way, so I'm just going to impose on you a background story, and then I'll try to answer the question. And the background story, maybe some of you know, is this notion of gene-culture coevolution. The idea that cultural innovations that we make might actually be forces for natural selection and be reshaping the trajectory of our species. And the most famous example of this is, so the idea is we evolve to be cultural animals, we manufacture culture. Culture then becomes part of our environment. For example, we domesticate animals. Now they're domestic animals in our environment, and that in turn changes the selection pressures upon us. It makes us, certain ones of us, more fit or less fit because they're now animals around us, for example. And in fact, that animal example is not a coincidence. The most famous example of gene-culture coevolution, the most well-worked out one, and there are many, and they're stunning, is the domestication of milk-producing animals. So between 3,000 and 9,000 years ago, there were at least a half dozen, probably many more, instances where humans domesticated milk-producing animals. Now, human beings, we have enzymes in us. The primary sugar in milk is lactose. And when we're babies, all mammals have the ability to digest this sugar. And we have an enzyme called lactase that allows us to do this. But that enzyme disappears when we are weaned. That is to say, it's no longer active in our bodies. Why should it be? We're not drinking milk. There's no source of milk, right? I mean, adult mammals don't suckle at the breasts of their mothers. And so there's no milk in the environment, and so evolution is very efficient. There'd be no reason to do that. And that was us as well, us humans as well, until about 9,000 years ago, when all of a sudden we domesticate cattle, camels, goats, sheep, multiple domestications. I'm just going to speak about cattle domestication in Africa and Europe right now. And now all of a sudden, because of our cultural innovation, because of our invention of this technology, because we've domesticated these animals and learned how to breed them and take care of them and everything else, there's milk in our environment, and adults can drink it. And so those among us who happen to have a mutation that allowed us to have lactase persistence, allowed us to be able to continue to digest milk even as adults, because now there was milk we could drink, we were weaned, but we could drink milk, had an advantage. And this advantage was that there was an additional source of nutrition, and we had access to hydration when there was spoilage in the water. So if there was some catastrophe that resulted in the water being deadly or having pathogens in it, we could drink milk, for example. So what's amazing is that multiple times, this is work that Sarah Tishkoff and her colleagues have done, multiple times in evolution, between 3,000 to 9,000 years ago, when a group of people in Africa had domesticated cattle, and there was a nearby group who had not, this lactase persistence evolved and reached very high levels of prevalence in the population that had domestic cattle. So this is the canonical example of gene-culture coevolution. What I've just told you is that something human beings can invent changes our evolutionary trajectory. We are different people. Many billions of people on the planet today are different because of something we invented. Well, once you accept that, and there are other amazing examples which we can talk about if you're interested in, it kind of opens up a Pandora's box, because now all of a sudden you can say, well, wait a minute, what about the invention of cities? We invented cities between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago. Maybe the kinds of brains, and therefore the kinds of genes that make those kinds of brains that can cope with cities, are different than the kinds of brains that could not. So our invention of cities advantages certain people with certain kinds of brains. And so therefore, maybe that's going on. Or maybe the invention of lenses by medieval lens grinders now is increasing the prevalence of myopia, right? So I would have been dead, 75,000 years ago. I would have been eaten by a lion. But now I can have glasses, so I survive and pass on my genes. So we're all becoming more myopic. Well, once you keep adducing these examples, pretty soon you get to the case where you're thinking like, well, what about the invention of computers or the internet? Is it possible that that is changing who we are? Is it possible that the kind of human beings that will be alive and thriving in 1,000 years, or 5,000 years, or 500 years, or 100 years, will be different? Now, we don't usually think of evolution working over historical time frames. In fact, it's only very recently that people began even considering this possibility. But I'm beginning to seriously think about this. Many people are, not just me. And I'll give you some examples. You must have been following the slaughter of elephants in Africa over the last few generations, the encroachments on the habitat. You've probably been reading the articles about tuskless elephants, right? So elephants are evolving to not have tusks. Yeah, like literally. Because, of course, the ones with tusks get killed. So the ones without tusks, there's always occasionally a mutation and you wouldn't have tusks. So now that's a very powerful force of selection. You kill the ones that don't have tusks. But that's literally happened in the last 30 to 50 years, a very dramatic change in this big mammal. So now it's not like if you're computer illiterate, we kill you. Therefore, only people who can use computers thrive and survive. But those kinds of cases of rapid evolution in historical time due to imposed stressors opens for me a number of questions in this regard. So I think, I'll give one last example. I think the invention of the printing press and the widespread dissemination of the capacity to read, which is not something innate to us, right? I mean, that's an invention. The speech is different. We've been talking for, it's unclear how long, but for hundreds of thousands of years. But reading is a very unusual thing. And I think that the ability to read is being advantaged by the prevalence of books. And I don't exclude the possibility that, that this has had a very dramatic impact on our evolution. So the internet could be like that. And it could have effects on much more rapid timeframes than we think. This is a crazy idea, but I think it could well be true. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, well, so...
Or did I meander too much?
No, that's good. I think, so obviously there are changes wrought by our production of culture and our entanglement with technology. And a subset of these could be differential breeding success that would have evolutionary consequences of the sort you just mentioned. But
good or bad, by the way.
Right, but yeah, it could. So I'd bring that up. So it's not clear to me that the selection for, let's say, higher cognitive economic success that our information technology is imposing on us is necessarily correlating with fecundity, right? Are tech wizards having more kids, right? I think there's reason to doubt.
Well, the super rich are now suddenly having 4 kids is now,
right, but
a vanity.
You're talking about 50 people or 500 people.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But you're right. I mean, I actually think we're going to be more religious. I'm sorry to tell you this.
Yeah.
But I think we're going to be.
I've heard rumors. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think actually there's a strong reason to suppose that religiosity and certain core personality traits that feed into religion are heritable. and therefore, and if people who are religious have more kids, and they do,
Yeah.
then we're out of luck.
Yeah, so secularism and economic success are fairly highly correlated, but if secular, successful people are not replacing themselves,
Correct.
then the evolutionary changes could be working at cross purposes to some of the other trends we're talking about.
Over hundreds of years. We're not talking
Yeah.
like over generations. We're talking
Right.
long horizons.
Right. But I guess biological adaptation aside.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily, I mean, these things are not necessarily, they're sort of, evolution is agnostic. So for example, it's possible that a trait that has been vitally important in our history, in human prehistory, in our evolution, which is, for example, the capacity to recognize friends and enemies, right? We have the elaborate cognitive machinery that allows us, first of all, to distinguish the unique identity of every one of you. I can look at all your faces, I can uniquely identify every one of you based on your faces. Interestingly, you also each have a different face, which you shouldn't take for granted, but you do. This is an evolutionary luxury, the ability to communicate an individual identity and to have other people detect it takes a lot of brain power and a lot of evolutionary machinery. But if imagine now that I have like Google Glass connected to the internet, and all of a sudden those among us who can't do that, they just have a little earpiece that says, that's Sam Harris, and actually he's your friend. And so, so now I can survive. Before, I wouldn't be able to survive. And so now this trait, which was crucial to our survival for tens of eons, now is no longer so.
Right, so we're going to be selecting for prosopagnosia in the next
yes,
generation?
Yes, I don't think prosopagnosia is going to be a problem in the future.
Right. Okay, so there, I think at the margins we could imagine that there are genetic implications to some of these changes. And then there's all the mad work we could do once we start meddling with our genes directly.
Oh, yeah.
It means we can decide to change the next generation or ourselves. But I think in the common experience we're all having is that our culture and its technology is changing us socially and psychologically. Genes aside, we have a very different experience of ourselves in the world. We have where we locate the real world is hard to specify. And occasionally I'll meet someone who has essentially no online life, right? They're either a true Luddite or for whatever reason, they could be a celebrated academic, but they just don't, as a point of pride, they don't use email and they've never been on social media and they have no idea what any of us are talking about when we talk about the problems of social media. And they're living in, from their point of view, they're living in the real world, right? I mean, the real world is something you can touch, right? If you can't bump into it, it's not the real world. And yet, their reputations are online, their career catastrophes are online. I'm trying to imagine the experience of someone like Jim Watson, who I have it on good knowledge that he was one of these people who basically had very little online life, and he did an interview where he put both feet in his mouth repeatedly, and those of us online could see what was happening to him, but he had to just get phone calls, presumably on a landline somewhere, to find out that he was every professional engagement that he had ever thought he had was now gone. So there's some fundamental change to our sense of the boundaries of the self and what is real. We live in virtual space to an amazing degree, and your own experience is a great example of this, because you were someone who, again, I'm sorry, I need to apologize probably for the third time to you, because
I'm going to grit my teeth.
There's a story he doesn't like to talk about.
I'm going to grit my teeth and get through this.
Every time I speak to him, I bring it up in some public context and say, I'm sorry, I know you don't want to talk about this, but now you have to talk about this. But anyway, so those of you who don't know, Nicholas was the long-suffering academic standing in the center of the quad at Yale, being berated by a mob of howling students who had been triggered by something and triggered, I guess, is the appropriate verb here, by something his wife wrote. And so there's footage of him, multiple cell phone angles of Nicholas being perhaps the most patient person on earth. Presumably there's a gene for that, and we should swab your saliva and find out what it is. And yet it's still hard to figure out how much this moral panic we all thought we were witnessing around you is a real world phenomenon, or it's something that is being exaggerated by our interaction with social media. I mean, if you live on Twitter, this moral panic of trigger warnings and extreme wokeness is a real issue, right? It's with civilizational implications. This is the greatest pressure against free speech that we're going to talk about, presumably tomorrow, is coming, I would argue, from the left, and yet it's hard to understand just what the boundary of this thing is, because you could live, presumably you could live 80 years in the quote real world and not encounter this, but you've encountered it in the real world, and we all saw it on the internet.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to swerve away a little bit from it and reframe this as a very interesting intellectual topic and take out the personal stuff from it. So here's a little anecdote. So my grandmother was born in Greece, actually she was a Byzantine Greek, so she was in Istanbul. And if you could talk to her, she's been dead for a long time, and ask her how many friends she had when she was a little girl in this Greek-speaking village in Anatolia, when she was 10, she would have said, had 1 or 2 best friends, and there were 4 or 5 of us girls, we hung out together. And if you could talk to my daughter, Lena, who's now 21, but when she was 11, 10 years ago, and ask her the same question, she would give you the same answer. Even though she has an iPhone in her pocket, the fundamental reality of the way we go about making friends has not been changed, right? This is something natural selection has shaped us for, this capacity for friendship. We have 1 or 2 best friends. We have a small group of intimate others that we're in connection with. So there are things that the technology, Facebook and the internet and Google and change, but there are things that it does not change, okay? For example, when the telephone was invented, there was a kind of moral panic that men would use this phone to, in a licentious way, prey on women. And that, as if a woman getting a phone call from a strange man, would you like to, do something with me? Would say, oh yes, since you use this phone, the answer is yes. You called me on this newfangled device, and so therefore yes. I would have said no, but you called me on this Bakelite black phone, and so now I'm going to say yes. So, like in St. Louis kind of phone. But anyway, so there was a moral panic that there would be, that there'd be a kind of complete breakdown in sexual mores, and but nevertheless, there wasn't, I don't think we didn't become a polygamous society or polygynous society because we invented the telephone. So there are certain core parts of our lived experience, our psychology, which is unaffected by technology. But there are other parts that are, and I'm going to bring it back to where you just said, because we are so interested in friends and what other people are doing, we evolved. This is very important. A familiarity with what others around us were doing and whether they meant us good or ill were instrumental, crucial to our survival. So we're very gossipy animals, right? We pay attention to what other people do. Reputations are very important. I think it's been quantified, like a huge fraction of our speech is about what other people are doing, So things like soap operas are grafted onto that, right? People become obsessed with soap operas and watch them religiously and think they have real relationships with the characters because this is an innate hunger that we have. And Facebook is like a soap opera, right? But Facebook and online social interactions are to real friendships as to what porn is to real sex, right? I mean, it's a complete exaggerated expression of what is an innate quality, which exploits and takes advantage of these deep hungers and needs that we have evolved to have.
Let me just push on that for 1 second, though, because I'm not sure the line between real and pseudo friendship can be drawn there. Because, for instance, I have relationships, certainly professional colleague relationships, where they're 99% virtual. So the people, basically, I have.
But that's not the distinction. It's not whether it's online or offline.
But
whether it's real or not real.
Well, but it can be. You can have a real relationship with many people who you have never met. I mean, there are people who
yes.
I have. I would certainly call them friendships, and yet it's almost entirely an email relationship, and it's an email and social media relationship, and yet these are people who, when push comes to shove, I'm willing to make enormous sacrifices for, and it's based on like in some cases our entire relationship is searchable in an email archive, right? And that's a weird, and there's none of this face-to-face. Mimetic facial play happening there. There's none of that familiarity, and that's not the basis of the rapport. And in many cases, the rapport is based on a shared worldview that somehow got mutually advertised online.
Yeah, but remember, people were corresponding and had these types of relationships. So the founding fathers, for example, or other historical figures were corresponding across oceans with other people for a long time, and it was very limited face-to-face contact, and nevertheless they felt intimate with these people and so forth. Right. So yes and no. So I was about to pivot and then come back to where you said. So there are these core commitments that we have: your ability to feel connected to another person, your desire for that connection, what you count as meaningful sacrifice or meaningful indicators of real friendship. All of those things have been shaped by the long arc of our evolution. Now comes modern technology, which is grafted onto that and is, for good or ill, working in the service of that, either exploiting it. So people spend a lot of time on online media because, as I said, we're gossipy creatures, so we're really interested in what other people are doing. So here's this tool that's like a drug that's just like feeding us information about what all these other people are doing, and we just want that, and so we just spend so much time doing that. But there are other things that online media offer us that are, I think, quite distinctive, and I would put four ways in which the online world is different than the offline world. So in most ways, as I've just argued, it's the similar. We want friendships, we want influence, we pay attention to other people. All those traits are the same, whether you're using letters or the telephone or Facebook. Those are fundamental qualities. But there are other things that are different. I think there are four such things. The first is what I would call the scale of interactions, and you just alluded to that. So these tools make it possible for us to track much larger numbers of individuals. They facilitate that, right? It would be harder for you without these tools to have this elaborate correspondence. I mean, some people did, but it's easier, frankly. So the scale of interactions is much higher. Another thing that's different is our communality. That is to say, our ability, we always were communal animals, we always cooperated with each other, but these tools have made it easier for us to do that. So for example, Wikipedia is a terrific example of that. You get thousands of people working together to maintain this common good in a way that would not have been possible. It's taking advantage of our inclination to work together and create public goods, but it's taking it to the next level. The third way is specificity. So it was always possible for you, even 30 years ago, if you wanted to find a Norwegian army veterinarian, this was a hard thing to do. But with the internet, it's not so hard, right? You can, do some searching and you'll zero in on the one guy that works for the Norwegian army and maintains their reindeer or whatever, So specificity, I think, is different. The internet gives us specificity. And the last thing that it gives us is what I've called virtuality, which is the capacity to pass as other people. Now, human beings could always do this, right? You could pretend to be someone you're not. For example, people could adopt a different gender. You could cross-dress, for example, but it was difficult to do that. If you were a man to pass as a woman 100 years ago or a woman to pass as a man, it was hard. But on the internet, it's trivial. You just have a different avatar, right? I mean, you can, and there are many amazing examples of people who have opposite sex avatars and really get into it. So that's, the internet has made that much easier too. So there are ways in which the internet has, I would say, building upon these long-standing fundamental impulses, in my view, has changed us a little. But I don't think as much as maybe you think.
Well, so there's this growing concern that many of us have that the internet is has become a vehicle for misinformation and divisiveness that is, if it hasn't crossed some tipping point, it seems perilously close to doing so, where we need to take some heroic steps to rein this in. And there are not that many levers that can be pulled, and the one that seems tempting to pull for many people is the one hooked up to free speech and to somehow limit the spread of ideas, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is, there's two, to speak specifically about social media, there's at least two problems that have conspired to give us this tissue of conspiracy theory and outrage. And one is just the people who are involved. So it's a question of who to platform or deplatform. And then there's just the algorithm and the business model that is promoting outrage over some other variable that might be more wholesome or conducive to sense making. So those are, I'm sure, distinct problems, and there may be others, but the one with respect to free speech and who to platform or not, this is worrying many of us because the calls to silence people seem to be coming disproportionately from the left at this point. And many of us on the left feel that free speech really is a master variable with respect to with respect to almost anything you could want epistemologically or ethically in an advanced civilization. I mean,
It's like a non-corrupt judiciary.
yeah,
It's a crucial, fundamental,
to speak about it as generically as possible, it's the only tool we have for mutual error correction, right? It's like basically, so again, to talk about what was happening 75,000 years ago, not a whole hell of a lot. Everything that happened that represents progress, technological, scientific, ethical, happened because somebody said, that's not such a good idea. Let's do it this way, right? And so conversation is the only algorithm we have, and many of us feel that erring on the side of letting every idea be expressed and combating it not with some coercive imposition of silence, but just better ideas, that is the master variable for progress. And yet, many people, and even many people in this room, are poised to take a different path there, given the political divisions, given the fact that you can find, until recently you could easily find ISIS propaganda on all of our platforms, and so I'm just wondering what you think of that, because again, you've been at that epicenter of
I struggle with that a lot because my bias is like yours. Like I want a free and open exchange of ideas, even bad ideas, and I have to tolerate bad ideas. If we're gonna have, I don't want to endow anybody, certainly not the government, and certainly even corporations, with the power to constrict what people say. So that's my bias, starting like yours. But I also recognize that that it's hard, right? Like the ISIS videos that you mentioned, or the beheading videos, or the Christchurch shooting that's being live cast. Those push me. Those are hard. Now, I think a lot of the battles that are being fought are, one of the things that amazed me is, like, for example, on the free speech debates on college campuses, the battle lines that they draw are so inane. I mean, they're so far from where you would get to the really hard problems. I mean, the really hard problems is what do you do when the university invites a dictator from a developing world country to come and speak? Like, that's a harder question, right? Like,
someone with blood on his hands.
Yes, I mean, said the guy's in power, so you can make the argument, well, we need to listen to him. He's, after all, the leader of this country, whether we like it or not. That person should be allowed to come onto our campus. But also, you could make the argument, no, that's outrageous. You shouldn't do that. But there were cases like this 30 years ago. People used to get exercised on university campuses. Oh, we can't have this person. They're a brutal dictator. But you rarely hear those kinds of conflicts, right? The conflicts we hear about university campuses are kind of silly. What the people are drawing the lines is, you can't have blocking the guy's name, Tatchell, the gay rights advocate in England. He was like deplatformed because he didn't have the proper perspective on trans issues. And really, that's, that to me is like, let the guy speak, and then you say something in opposition to what he's saying. Anyway, I think that, so I would agree with all of that. I wouldn't quite agree, like I want to get my house in order, so I'm very concerned about what's happening to my left, but I also think there's a lot of threats from the right. And I think the right's in power right now in state houses around the country, and certainly in the White House. And it's very tempting for anyone in power to try to silence other people. Actually, and so we see a lot of movement in state houses around the country to like constrain what faculty can say or what departments are allowed and so forth. There was just a case recently of a police department that got very upset because someone posted something accusatory on their Facebook page, and these people, right, I'm sure would have been quite happy to poke fun at college students, and yet as soon as someone posts something derogatory on their Facebook page, they get upset. So yes, I think on college campuses, I think it's primarily to these days. Let's not forget McCarthyism, right? So 50 years ago, it was the other way.
The pendulum swings.
Yeah. So I agree on college campuses these days, but I don't think in the broader society. I think it's we all, whatever our political persuasion, I think have a common interest and a common obligation to defend these core principles. I want to say one more thing, which is a bit of a digression, and is tied a little bit to the book, which is so many animals have the capacity to learn, right? A little fish in the sea learns that if it swims up to the light, it finds food there, right? So many animals learn by exposure to their environment. Some animals also have the capacity to learn socially. Now, this is uncommon, but it's super efficient. So, for example, you put your hand in the fire, you learn not to do that, you paid a price, and you acquired some knowledge. I can watch you put your hand in the fire. I gain almost as much knowledge, but I pay none of the price. So it's really efficient for me to watch you and learn socially by watching you.
I picture a lot of people learning that lesson from watching me on Twitter.
Yeah, yes. I'm right behind you, Sam. Yeah, exactly. I'm right behind you, brother. I'm watching you carefully and trying to avoid those fires. But we do something that is exceedingly uncommon in the animal kingdom, which is we also teach each other. And this is different. Teaching is when I affirmatively set out to show you how to do something. And ultimately, this capacity for teaching and social learning, which I regard as a core aspect of our humanity, and is very rare in the animal kingdom, is ultimately the source of all of our wealth. So this ability to accumulate and transmit knowledge across time, across generations, to accumulate knowledge, and across space, so I can teach you something right now and you can go over there and teach someone else, this core function is crucial for our ability to have the civilization that we have. And that's why free speech is so important, because you cannot achieve that. You cannot enact this innate and fundamental and deeply important quality, this capacity for teaching, if you don't permit and foster an environment in which people can talk and speak freely to each other. So that's how I would connect the free speech debate to evolutionary biology.
Right. I feel the pressure of time here, and I know we want to make this a genuine conversation, so we should, I think we should open it up to the audience and just go for questions. Yeah.
My name is Marco, an economist by training, so think in terms of incentives. One question I have is, you've made the point that the transmission of knowledge has been essential to the growth of our society and to our success as a species. Now, something that seems to have happened recently because of our economic success is the imperative to survive, in a sense, has been diminished. I think that matters both in terms of the reproductive success of different abilities, and Sam, you mentioned that, but it also creates a situation which connects to the issue of social media. So a situation where the world has become increasingly complex. We face increasingly complex questions across a number of issues, whether it's healthcare, medicine, energy. And yet, the imperative to acquire information, to understand these issues, seems to have disappeared, and social media seems to make it extremely easy and attractive for each and every one of us to feel like we are an expert simply because we get a pre-cooked opinion on one social media channel, and almost nobody seems to want to go beyond that. So is this an area where actually social media becomes a barrier to further progress and negates the transmission of knowledge that you were talking about?
If I've understood your question correctly, I think it's analogous to what concerns people might have had when encyclopedias were printed and invented. So prior to that, a learned person had to have all the knowledge in their own brain, whereas now they could have a book that had the knowledge, so maybe they didn't have to have the mental discipline to Yeah, so you're talking about expertise rather than the actual, so I'm understanding your question better. So you're not saying, are we becoming mentally lazy because there's so much information that's stored online? You're asking, are we being inundated with falsehoods and losing the capacity to discern the truth from falsehood? Is that what you're asking? Yes. Yes, and also just the practice, right? I was just talking to Len before dinner, and we were talking about. I mean, you know, I do not want to come across as, you know, kids these days, because literally you can open the Republic, Plato's Republic, and he talks about kids these days. So, you know, people have been talking about kids these days, you know, for thousands of years. So I do not want to be seen as like saying kids these days, you know, kids these days. However, kids these days, yeah, exactly, kids these days. So we're talking about, you know, what has changed in American universities. I think there is a sense that the discipline of learning a lot of stuff and learning how to learn a lot of stuff is becoming a bit less important in our elite institutions than it used to be. So I think you might be onto something. And I think that when that capacity begins to get lost, I think people are much more, you know, become useful idiots, right? They're much more easy for them to just fall sway to, you know, to falsehoods. And I see that a lot, actually, online. I've made the mistake now, and I now try not to ever make it again. I fell prey to a certain kind of thing, internet outrage, where people would tweet a story, for example, and it would be about some event, and I would read the story, and I would judge the reputation of the paper, and then I would say, this is outrageous, or, you know, I have an opinion about this topic, and so I'm going to, you know, send out my opinion on this topic, and I would, you know, send out an opinion plus the link and so forth. And then many times I did this, and I hadn't read the date. And it was like 10 years old.
Is there a name for that? This has happened to all of us.
Oh yeah, so
right.
it's humiliating. Yeah. And then you send it out, and then the first in your mention, someone says, you know, you idiot, that was 5 years ago. And, you know, the resolution for that is exactly the resolution you were calling for. So cut out the fake outrage. And so that happened to me a few times. Now I've learned, and I rarely screw up. I sometimes still do. And I read the date, you know, and I try to figure out. So
how old is too old?
To do that.
What should be the half-life of outrage?
Well, no, I think it's okay to express an opinion, but you have to acknowledge this was an event 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 2 years. It's not today.
Well, I caught myself doing that the other day, and it was like 6 weeks old, and I thought that was, you know, the statute of limitations has passed on that.
6 weeks? No, I think you're allowed to comment.
No, it's just it was in the wrong month. I just felt like I'm going to get there's going to be too much pain.
Some people will get
associated with this.
Oh my God, you're resetting me.
Well,
so we danced around your question. I mean, I think you're onto something, but I don't know what the evidence for it would be. But I don't disagree with your sentiment.
But I think there's a related concern there, which is that the internet is making it easier to fact check things and to engage with the sum total of all knowledge. But it's also making it easier to silo yourself and find some corroborating opinion for your crazy conspiracy theory that you're going to spend the rest of your life trying to prove, right? So I mean, when you meet someone who is really siloed, and again, I mean, you know, we all have pretensions of not being siloed. We all can be siloed in our own ways, but when you meet someone who is just clearly playing a very elaborate game of confirmation bias and disposed to do that, right? They don't have all of the tools of intellectual honesty that would cause them to get out of that game. They have resources now that it's hard to picture anyone ever having before, you know. And so you can always and the thing, and also to your point about the fact that we no longer have real world face-to-face reference points for this. I mean, this is a kind of a personal issue with me because I have a member of my own family who is a 9/11 truther. And you can imagine, if you know anything about me, you can imagine how much exquisite pain this has produced for me. And every 6 months or a year or so, something in me will snap that I didn't know I had, and I'll write the 2-hour email and just trying to perform an exorcism on him, and it never works, needless to say. But when I see what he can do, like he can spend forever in that space, and he has no idea that half of the websites or the white papers he's consuming are written by 18-year-olds, who
or Russians.
Yeah, I mean, he's not meeting the people. Like if he could meet these people at a conference, many of them would be advertising their lack of credibility just at a distance of 50 yards, right? And anyway,
it's worse than that. So psychiatrists had a serious problem in the middle of the 20th century in defining delusions. And the problem was...
Well, they still have it in the DSM.
Yeah,
because they accept religious delusions or irrational religious beliefs. Irrational beliefs are delusions, but unless they're religious. If they're religious, you get a pass.
Do you know how they drew the distinction? Well, they faced this problem in the mid-20th century. Mm-hmm. They were like, okay, so delusion is when you believe something that's like not real, and they have a narrow technique, believe things unseen and so forth. And then they were like, well, wait a minute, hold on, that's what religion is. How are we going to draw the distinction? So they came up with this rule of thumb, which is that a religion is something that at least 100 people believe. Right. And if 100 people or more believe it, it's a religion and you're not crazy. But if fewer than 100 people believe this thing, then you're crazy. And so this was how they kind of squared the circle. And this state of affairs persisted until the invention of the internet. So now all of a sudden on the internet, there are these people that believe in something called gang stalking. They believe the government is like constantly following them around and everything else. And they used to be certifiably crazy. But now, actually, they can find each other on the internet and reinforce their beliefs. Right. There are hundreds of people who have now formed this group. And so maybe we can't consider them delusional anymore by using... How are we going to draw the distinction between people who have that delusional architecture and people who have, Pastafarians or something? So it's an ongoing problem, which I know plays right to this that's Sam Harris bait.
Welcome to my wheelhouse.
Yes.
Steve, I saw your hand.
We're talking about cultural evolution. It's fascinating. It would seem to me that it's the main vector of human progress today, that if you compare the clock rate of cultural evolution to biological genetic evolution, right? They're not even on the same page, and it sort of subsumes everything. And if you think about why we feel like we might be getting smarter as a species, it's not because our brains have changed. It's because we accumulate knowledge, externalized. Our cultural norms now are so different from 2,000 years ago. And so if we think about the internet and communication media, it feels to me that the more you communicate, the more you could accelerate this evolution, because it's the mimetic domain, right? So if more people communicate over broader spans, you would expect this to continue accelerating. And the latest version with social networks, it seems, you have feedback loops. So we can see what does the Facebook experiment versus the Twitter experiment in terms of a social construct around the semi-automated nuance around communication constructs, and see what we like and what we don't like. So should we, at some level, be celebrating these as the way in which we accelerate progress is to accelerate experiments, and the way you do that is having feedback loops on your communication networks?
But are you experiencing that progress on those networks?
Well, no, I mean, there's going to be experiments, right? And so at some level, yes. I think people are having a conversation they didn't have before about, I'll just random examples, conversations about income inequality or the long-term trends around the dangers of the current Twitter and Facebook platforms. 20 years ago, I don't know if they were quite the same level of awareness that would sprout up in the course of a year or two about a pandemic phenomenon that's going on around us that may otherwise not have just been discussed.
Okay. Except there seems to be a pandemic of silencing and reputational destruction around taboo utterances within that conversation. And
Right, so I
the
guess
line
the
for
question
taboo
would
is
be,
is
as a
drifting in the
framework
wrong
for how we
direction.
communicate, maybe these are bad ones, but I would hope we had more experiments. Like,
I mean,
let's
I
say,
think
let's say
are you
Instagram
saying,
gets rid of the like
like,
button, or the thumbs up or whatever the hell it is on the Instagram platform. If they actually do that, it would be interesting to see what happens, right?
We're like at the phase where, we're belching black smoke from the cars, but then eventually we'll get the technology right. And so right now, you're saying, I think, that they're...
Well, let me say what I think I feel more strongly about.
Yeah.
Short of social networks, let's say the email communication that both of you, have experienced, your ability to reach a broader group, those
Yes.
four phenomena, means that we have more communication or more rapid spread of ideas, more entrepreneurship.
Which is good.
And every vector I see is
Yes.
just more idea spreading and more
Yes.
cross-pollination ideas, and the recombination of ideas into new ideas, which
Yes.
is the definition of progress. The thing I'm trying to figure out is, are the social networks, like everything from Slack to email, Slack in the workplace, oh my God, is having profound effects on how people work. We're at least running more communication framework experiments. And maybe we decide they're all bad, but at least they're running experiments.
No, I think if you're asking if these technologies are ultimately in the service of more information spreading to more people, will they ultimately be a net positive? I think I would join you on that. But I also think it's fair to say there are some downsides to it that need some engineering fixes, we need to think about. So for example, I was just having a conversation at dinner, and I've been thinking a little bit about this for some time. I think it's amazing the way our openness in our society and our technology has been weaponized against us either we are doing some of that to ourselves, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, and some of it our enemies are doing this to us, are fomenting discord. Now, does that mean I want to cut off the technology altogether? No, I don't think so. But I do think we need to be mindful of the ways in which we need to adjust it, to maximize its benefits. So I agree with you that I think that in general terms, the more rapid and complete and extensive sharing of information, the better. There is one sense in which, there are a couple senses in which that is not always the case. First of all, you can inundate people with information, right? So you can overdo it, and so you learn nothing, right? If I bring you into a classroom, I try to teach you calculus, there's an orderly, disciplined way I can do that slowly and steadily and teach you calculus. Or I can just overwhelm you, and then you leave the classroom with nothing. So I think when you flood the recipient with information, that's equivalent to giving them no information. So there's some kind of in between that I also think is important to be sensitive to.
Sam and Nick, thank you. So in medicine, we talk about the contra coup injury, which is the whiplash secondary injury you get, the rebound effects. So let's just say what we're seeing now is the second order effect of things that happened 7 years ago. What are things that you guys are thinking about that'll be a reaction, kind of like the Hegelian dialectic to what's going on today? What will be the other reactions? Like one example I was thinking about was the Boko Haram. After they abducted the girls, there was big outrage, and then that there was extinction, and then they went on and did it again, and they did it with impunity. There was absolutely no reaction. They did it again and again. So one of the consequences of the outrage was there was just saturation, and people didn't want to engage anymore. What are other things that you guys worry about?
Well, I do worry about that saturation effect, just even to take the local case of politics in the US. There is something about, to call it a strategy is probably too generous, but Trump's way of continuing to trigger the outrage from the left, I think has a kind of ceiling effect where it's either just too boring or too toxic or too pointless to keep reacting, and then there's no reaction, right? And the bar for what is intolerable keeps going up, right? So many of us have done this bit of arithmetic where you just imagine anyone else doing this thing that he just did, or imagine. The way I've thought about it for the last 2 years is that if he were 1/10 as bad, he would seem worse, because we would have a much clearer signal that a norm had been breached, right? But this norm gets breached 10 times a day, so there's just nothing to react to anymore. So I feel like, even speaking personally, I feel like I have gone to sleep on these issues politically and decided to pick my battles just because it's too tiresome to stay at the level, stay at 11, with your outrage. But 11 is still appropriate for many of these things. But it's just amazing that like the Mueller report gets rolled out, and the net result is that it gets successfully spun as exonerating him, right? Where it does nothing of the kind, and yet it seems to me that our society has basically moved on, right? I think that's probably a global problem as well. It's like the news cycle has become 24 hours. I mean, to take a different example, but one that's also mystifying to me. The largest mass shooting in American history, the Vegas shooting, right? That disappeared from the news in like 72 hours, and we still don't. I still don't know the guy's name, right? I've forgotten the shooter's name. We still don't know why he did what he did, if there is a why. But if you had told me, the day before that the biggest mass shooting in American history was going to be something that couldn't sustain itself over the course of 72 hours in a news cycle, I would say there's a 0% chance that that's true. And yet, for some reason, we just, the pace of things has caused us to kind of lose sight of huge events like that. So it's I don't know, I feel like cognitively and our ability to have appropriate emotional responses to data, to problems in the world, I think we're, again, this comes back to the beginning of this conversation. It's like I think we all have a sense that we are ourselves using certain technology, but the boundary of the self, what it's like to be you and your moral intuitions and your capacity to even pay attention to things, it has migrated away from what's in your head, and much of it is distributed across technology. Your engagement with you've outsourced, not you personally, all of us have outsourced much of our epistemology to these tools, and as the tools change, we change.
I would just add to that on the issue of when will it end and what this sort of outrage mentality. I think if you had asked me a year ago or 6 months ago, I would have said to you, I think the pendulum was beginning to swing back on college campuses. I don't think that anymore. I think actually John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff think we have another 10 years of this, and I actually now think they're probably right, because I just keep seeing cases that are just astonishing to me that on college campuses, but even outside of college campuses, on our broader society, the things that Sam was alluding to earlier, the kind of self-censoring, the kind of mob action, the kind of sort of online outrage. There's a whole problem in young adult fiction, which I have only vaguely been following, where you can't, books aren't even published before they are pulled by publishers for fear, and just many, many examples in many sectors of our society. So corporations that encourage their employees. I think Google has some serious problems right now. Actually, Google, I think, is even becoming concerned that maybe there are spies literally causing problems among their workforce. I don't know if this is true. Probably some of you know if this is true, but that's not my point. What I wanted to say was that I think that saying stupid things on the internet, the reason this will stop being a problem is that it'll be like politicians who smoke marijuana now. So, in other words, when I was a boy, you couldn't win an election if you had smoked marijuana in college. But now everyone smoked marijuana in college. So, it doesn't matter. You can win an election because you smoke, even if you smoke marijuana in college. So I think what will happen in 15 years is there'll be so many people that have said so many stupid things, and we'll just exhaust ourselves from being outraged, and there'll be kind of a kind of forgiveness. Now it's like, okay, people say stupid things online, either in the past, so like if you did it a long time ago, we don't care anymore, Unlike now, where if you resurrect something stupid that someone said 10 years ago, it can become a huge, problem. Or even in the present. I think that when the technology is so widely available and can record everything you ever said, people will come to realize again that sometimes human beings say stupid things at the wrong time, and that's okay. We're human, and it won't be so problematic anymore. I don't know if that's going to happen, but if I had to guess, in 15 or 30 years, in half a generation or a generation, having said something dumb will no longer be, grounds for dismissal from a firm or from a university.
Right. Well, the bigger concern, though, in the moment is that it's not saying stupid things that gets you.
No, you can correct things. I know.
You can just say
People can be outraged.
scientifically.
Oh, I know.
Absolutely
I know.
bulletproof.
No, but saying
things.
something that
Yeah.
someone objects
Yes.
to,
Yes.
So one of the things that fascinates me about the conversation is that there's sort of an implicit feeling in my mind that this is a relatively small adjustment to what previously was. And if I think about these technologies, if I assume that instead they are actually an incredibly profound adjustment, might they, invalidate the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that at least we would have to completely rethink what we would have to do to instantiate the spirit rather than the letter. And I guess what my question to you guys would be, are we getting this,
just to clarify, you mean historically, not evolutionarily. So you're asking, does the invention of the internet change the action of historical
have we
forces?
created a new system of selective pressures
Yeah.
that is so shifted from the previous adaptive landscape,
Historically speaking.
over a brief period of time, that what we are actually at the beginning of is a period of upheaval that, because we think of these things as Twitter is represented by a cute bird, Facebook by an upward pointing thumb, and Google by a child's scrawl in primary colors probably drawn in crayon, that in fact these technologies are in fact so profound and so different that they are connecting people who should never have been connected with assumptions that cannot be bridged, and that we are actually at the beginning of a period of incredible cultural, political, and probably physical upheaval, and that we're not actually capable of rethinking things. We still think of the Constitution as a durable object and a social media platform as an ephemeral one, and that in fact we may have crossed over into some different territory by which we have to rethink our ordering of sense-making architectures, and that in fact the adaptations that are going to be necessary, like for example, what if the most important thing that our younger generation, these kids today, are telling us is that they need to retreat from the consequences of so much data, so much specificity? Maybe the scientific method is giving us far too much information. We can't live with the illusions we had that all men are created equal, and that in fact that there is a retreat from reason that is being precipitated by this change in the adaptive landscape. Is it possible that we're just getting this entire conversation wrong by implicitly assuming that this is a relatively modest perturbation on what was previously?
Well, that's not my assumption. Maybe more your assumption that is
I would put
mine,
the information revolution up there with the agricultural invention of fire, agricultural revolution, industrial revolution. I mean, I think what we're in the midst of is certainly as radically affecting our society and our social organization as those, right? As agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution.
Okay, so that wasn't...
For sure, I would grant that.
Wow.
Oh God, yes. I mean, I think these technologies are just astonishingly important in every axis: our productivity, our social interactions, and everything else. What I wasn't, and you don't seem to be going there, is whether and how fast. And I was talking about this at the beginning. They're changing the evolutionary adaptive landscape, and there I was speculating at the beginning, and I think it is, but not over the short, super short, like our lifetime horizon.
Yeah, I think we could be biologically the same 100 years from now and be unrecognizable to ourselves. And it's not, biology, again, we could deliberately change our biology, and those changes could be introduced very quickly. But even if we didn't, the cultural change, so much of what we are, and again, everything that differentiates us from our ancestors 75,000 years ago is happening at the level of culture.
Yes.
Technology.
I mean, you guys all know this. If you took any high school graduate from who'd learned calculus in this city and you moved them back 500 years ago, they'd be the smartest mathematician on the planet. I mean, that's cumulative culture, where we can teach people, humans have created the calculus, Isaac Newton invented the calculus at the rate at which we teach it, which is just mind-boggling. And over a course of a year, he invents calculus, and that's how long it takes us to learn it. But it's astonishing that how we transmit that. So yes, I think in 100 years we could be quite different. We'd be still biologically the same. I don't know whether the online media, the internet, is a threat to our constitutional order. But if you look at the Industrial Revolution, there was clearly a lot of political realignment that took place. Now that was for the better, mostly. But maybe it needn't be. Maybe 100 years from now, people will look back at the information revolution and find it dystopian rather than utopian. Or maybe they'll be lulled. Maybe from our perspective, it'll look dystopian, but they'll look and say, "Oh, this is great." I don't know. But it's radical.
Well, on that note, let me take a moment to thank Sam and Nick. I think we are really dealing with fairly radical changes, and I think that is something that we are trying to process at the center, and I'm really glad that you guys took the time to come and talk to us about this, and I really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.